The Deadeye has been a very popular Ascendancy since the launch of Path of Exile 2's early access in December of 2024, and looking back at the initial philosophy behind some of the design decisions that led to Path of Exile 2 being a separate game from Path of Exile 1 in the first place, it's not too difficult to see why. Path of Exile 2, at least in concept, was supposed to be a bit more of a deliberate action RPG, with slower, more methodical combat and recognisable, distinctive encounters. That appeared to be the plan, and it was one of the major cited reasons for Path of Exile 2 existing as a standalone game alongside PoE 1, instead of just releasing as originally planned to be a major update to it, with Jonathan stating at ExileCon 2024 that there was a point where we realised that our plan to replace PoE 1 with PoE 2 would essentially be getting rid of a game that people love for no real reason. This statement made a lot of sense upon the launch of Path of Exile 2's early access at the end of last year, because everyone could see just how different the two games were. Some people preferred the sequel, whilst others preferred the original, but that's not an important factor here. All that matters is that the reasoning for PoE 2 existing as a standalone game made a lot of sense at this stage. Now, what exactly does all of this have to do with the Deadeye Ascendancy? Well, back then, the Deadeye simply had access to the most speed in terms of movement and skill usage, and in PoE 2, those stats are incredibly sought after because they're very hard to come by. In fact, one of the biggest complaints about Path of Exile 2 all the way back up to just prior to patch 0.3 was to do with character movement speed. Many players had shown dissatisfaction in regards to how fast their characters were able to move, and of course there were several factors at play here. It wasn't just the actual amount of movement speed on any one character, it was also the map layouts that often featured long, winding passages with several areas that were completely void of any real interaction, with monsters or otherwise, leading to gameplay moments where you're just running from point A to point B and nothing interesting is happening during that travel period. In response to this issue, GGG added the sprinting mechanic to the game in patch 0.3, which overall seems to have been quite well received. But this key problem right here was just one of many where the Deadeye's exclusive access to improved speed meant that this was simply less of a problem for this particular Ascendancy compared to any of the other Ascendancies. After all, the faster you're able to move, the less time spent traversing empty areas, and the more time spent actually playing the game. Now here's the thing, as Path of Exile 2 has been developing over the past 10 months or so since its early access launch, one thing has been very apparent to me, and that is that the direction that PoE 2 appears to be taking is moving swiftly away from those original design concepts. In its current state, this game is simply not that slow, methodical ARPG that it looked like it was going to be from all of the previews that we saw and all of the dialogue that we heard prior to its launch. In fact, looking at some of the current gameplay, you'd be forgiven for thinking that you're watching PoE 1. Super fast characters bolting across the map, ridiculous levels of damage, absolutely melting bosses, and massive screen clearing abilities. This does not look like the PoE 2 that was showcased prior to launch. Now, don't get me wrong here, I've had a lot of fun playing patch 0.3, notably more fun than I had in 0.1 or 0.2, but it's quite obvious that the game has sped up dramatically in the last few updates. But once again, what does all of this have to do with the Deadeye? Well, you see, there's a bunch of remnants of that old philosophy still present in the game right now. The reduced attack speed on mace and two-hander notables, for example. The hidden, less movement speed penalty on some body armors and shields. The lack of, quote-unquote, real movement speed abilities. More on that one in a moment. There's also the extremely limited access to movement speed, especially outside of the dexterity area of the tree. All of these things existing and being true in the current Path of Exile 2 game version are of massive benefit to the Deadeye. An Ascendancy that's positioning on the tree already lends itself well to the most overperforming archetype in the game, that being ranged attack builds, whilst also finding itself amongst the most favourable defensive options, both evasion and energy shield, not to mention the ease of access to the handful of rare movement speed clusters on the tree. And when you combine all of that with the Deadeye's access to Tailwind, a buff that at maximum stacks provides 10% increased movement speed, 30% increased skill speed, and 150% increased evasion rating, you can begin to see just why this class is head and shoulders above everything else. Essentially, as the game has been studied and figured out over the past few major updates, and as player power has been bumped up not just through the result of balance changes, but also as a result of massive improvements to crafting in patch 0.3, it has become obvious that you can deal enough damage to the point of being able to trivialize all of the content in the game, and have good enough defenses where you don't just fall over to a stray hit fired in your general direction. But most important of all, of course, you can have all of those things whilst also being the fastest. The fastest at running maps, the fastest at killing bosses, and based on all of the complaints about character movement speed from older game versions, and based on the massive popularity of the Deadeye in 0.3, it looks like that is what a large majority of players want. And part of the issue here, I feel, is game balance, not in terms of character to character comparison, but in terms of monster power versus player power. Right now, many of the popular builds are able to just delete bosses, and this isn't something that happens in the endgame once you secure very good gear. No, this is happening in the campaign. The lightning arrow builds, the grenade builds, even some mace and spell builds are able to completely annihilate campaign bosses with average gear before they even do any mechanics. And this is a recurring theme in Path of Exile 2. It continues into the endgame with map bosses and ultimately pinnacle bosses as well. And I mentioned this in my previous video on the meta of patch 0.3, but if damage is a non-issue, if the average build is able to achieve that level of damage to the point of trivializing these encounters, then beyond that, where do you invest your character power? Well, most people choose speed, because speed is a multiplier on that damage, and it means you can do whatever you want to do that much faster. Hence the massive popularity of the Deadeye, unlocking speed that no other class can access. Now, one of the other topics that's bound to be brought up in the comments is content creators, and how they have a massive impact on the meta, and on what's being played and what's not being played, due to what's said after the patch notes are revealed, and obviously due to the build guides that they put out. And this is absolutely true, they do have a huge impact on the meta, but ultimately you need to question why they are putting out a build guide using particular skills and on a particular ascendancy. For some creators, that's because they think that that is the best build based on the information they have. The idea that Deadeye is only popular because Fubgun made a build is completely ridiculous. No, Fubgun made a Deadeye build because he thinks that Deadeye is the best, and those factors together have contributed to the meta of 0.3. Now, I think if Path of Exile 2 is going to continue on its current trajectory, the remnants of a much slower paced game need to be reviewed, and access to crucial stats such as movement speed and skill speed should be more widely available to avoid a 0.3 scenario where a giant majority of players are playing a single ascendancy and a handful of the same skills. The sprint mechanic was a decent addition to alleviate some of the problems players were facing, but it doesn't solve movement during combat for the majority of gameplay. And speaking of movement during combat, don't even get me started on the rower. That skill is completely ridiculous, and to be honest, it probably needs the Grim Feast treatment at this point. They need to go back to the drawing board on that one. But will we see more Ascendancy diversity in patch 0.4 in December? Let me know what you think about that by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.